Comes from Matthew chapter 13, verses 31 to 33 and 44 to 46. He put another parable to them. The kingdom of heaven, he said, is like a grain of mustard seed, which someone took and sowed in his field. It's the smallest of all the seeds, but when it grows, it turns into the biggest of the shrubs. It becomes a tree, and the birds in the sky can come and nest in its branches. He told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven, Jesus continued, is like a treasure hidden in a field. Someone found it and hid it, and in great delight went off and sold everything he possessed and bought that field. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a trader who was looking for fine pearls, and who found one that was spectacularly valuable. He went off and sold everything he possessed and bought it.
Thank you, and welcome again. Short reading today, a few of Jesus' parables there from Matthew 13. As we saw in the Bible Project video, this is one of the sections where he teaches in parables. There's other intervening things that happen, and then we see Jesus teaching to different groups of people. In chapter 13, he's teaching to crowds, and then you see him moving to just speaking to his disciples, sometimes explaining or trying to explain to them what his parables meant, other times just leaving the parables sit as they are. So the one I want to focus on today is, I've titled the message, The Woman Who Hid Leaven. But just to back up a little, to show the context of where we've come, 2 weeks ago we considered the parable of the sower. That's the parable that is about 4 different types of soil, 4 different types of ground. Last week was the wheat and the weeds, so that the focus shifted from the soil to the wheat and weeds, or to people. Jesus was saying in this parable that gardeners should not weed their gardens, which is a hard thing to understand for us, because we're so used to passing judgment on the weeds, yanking them out. But he specifically says in this parable, when his disciples ask him, or the servants in the parable, should we go in and pull the weeds out? He says, no, don't do that, because if you do that, you'll destroy the wheat along with the weeds. Let them both grow together until the time of the harvest. When he talks about weeds, you may remember, he used the word that's translated in English as darnel. Darnel is a weed that looks almost exactly like wheat. So Jesus is saying in this parable, yeah, there'll be weeds among you people, but it's going to be very difficult for you to tell the difference between the wheat and the weeds. And we are so confident in our ability to tell the difference between good and evil, between the good guys and the bad guys. But that parable last week is all about cautioning us against that, cautioning us about making those judgments, and about pulling out or weeding out people that we think might be weeds. We talked in the last 2 weeks about confirmation bias, the phenomenon that when you have a belief, you tend to look for other evidence to support what you already believe. This is pervasive among people, and it's pervasive today. It's why we group up together on social media with people that believe the way we do, and we often argue with people that believe differently, because we've already made a decision. We've already decided that we're the good guys. We're standing in the right place, and then we just go seeking confirmation of that. And if anything comes that challenges that, we tend to reject those facts, even though they're factual. We tend to do that. So that we just need to be aware of the human's propensity for confirmation bias. Because if we're not aware of it, it's very difficult for us to learn anything new. It's very difficult for us to hear anything differently, because we just reject it out of hand. Jesus knew when he taught in parables that some people would hear and understand him, and that others wouldn't. It didn't seem to trouble him. I was trained to be a teacher, and I would have been very disturbed, and my professors would have been disturbed if only half of my music class understood what I was talking about. But in the case of Jesus, he wasn't troubled about that. He just knew some people would be in a place where they could hear and understand him, other people would not. But this parable today that about the yeast or the leaven gives me some hope in that regard, and we'll get to that as we go. So today's parable I've titled The Woman Who Hid Leaven. Usually this parable is referred to as the parable of the leaven or the parable of the yeast. But I've chosen to to put a different spin on it today, putting emphasis on the woman rather than the leaven. To put the woman up front, the woman who hid leaven, and the leaven, of course, is also very important. So it's just one verse long. The kingdom of heaven is like leaven, he said, which a woman took and hid inside 3 measures of flour until the whole thing was leavened. So being only one verse long, we get to stop and savor this parable today. What is better than the smell of freshly baked bread? There's not many things, I don't think, that capture my attention like that, and that I savor so much. It may go back to the fact that my grandmother lived with us for many years while I was growing up, and she would often get up early in the morning and make what she called as yeast bread. What she meant by that was homemade bread that used leaven, that used yeast. And I can remember waking up in my bed smelling that bread, and that got me out of bed in a hurry, because there's not much in my estimation that smells better than freshly baked bread. When she did that, she used a dry yeast product like this. Because if you just mix flour and water and maybe a little sugar together and bake it, you get something that looks more like crackers than bread. It just is flat and brittle, right? But in order to get bread to rise, you have to add leaven. This commercial leaven here, this active dry yeast, is a very convenient form of leaven. But this would not have been what the woman in Jesus' parable would have used. They didn't have active dry yeast at that point. She couldn't go down to the Costco or Hannaford's or something and buy some Fleischmann's yeast. So they would have to make their own leaven. And the way you'd make leaven is you'd take a little ground wheat that had already been milled, and you'd mix it with water, you'd cover it up and put it in a warm place, preferably without any breeze, just a still location, and you'd let it sit there. And as that mixture sets, a fermentation process begins. The enzymes in the wheat begin to break down the starch in the flour and convert it to sugar, to glucose. So this is also referred to as sourdough starter, leaven or sourdough starter. And when the mixture develops a sour smell and has bubbles in it, it's ready to be used, and it looks something like this. Really appetizing, huh? It doesn't look very appetizing. It doesn't smell very appetizing. It has a bit of a sour smell to it, but this is what makes possible that heavenly aroma of freshly baked bread. Without this, we couldn't get that bread, neither the taste of it or the aroma of it. So I wonder if this is what Jesus maybe had in mind when he's telling this parable. The kingdom of heaven is like leaven, he said, which a woman took and hid inside 3 measures of flour until the whole thing was leavened. That he was bringing into the world the kingdom of heaven. He's saying the kingdom of heaven is like leaven. He is our best representation of the kingdom of heaven, isn't he? But it would be considered or perceived as sour. We wouldn't immediately recognize it as something attractive or appealing. If the kingdom of heaven is like leaven, at this point he's saying the kingdom of heaven is like leaven, not like bread. He's backing us up a step, saying the kingdom of heaven is actually like this gooey, smelly substance that isn't very attractive, isn't very appealing, certainly isn't appetizing. It reminds me of the words that the prophet Isaiah said, which we understand him to be speaking about Jesus. For he grew up before him like a young plant, like a root out of dry ground. He had no form or majesty that we should look at him, nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by others, a man of suffering and acquainted with infirmity, and as one from whom others hide their faces. He was despised, and we held him of no account. He grew up like a young plant out of dry ground, but he was not desirable. He was not appealing. And we see that all through his ministry. The video we watched before highlighted the fact that some people liked him, some people followed him, but many people resisted him. They didn't find him the kind of person they wanted to emulate and follow. And they hid their faces from him. They would leave. that sounds a lot like sourdough starter to me. It's actually a fermentation process that takes place when making leaven is actually, and what's going on is the flour and the water, the mixture, the fermentation is actually the start of decomposition. If you left that for a long time, it would completely decompose. The wheat is actually beginning to undergo a breaking down of its former chemical structure. Now, if you look up structure, the word structure, I looked it up. Structure is of something is defined as the arrangement of and relations between the parts or elements of something complex. Let me say that again. The structure of something is defined as the arrangement of and relations between the parts or elements of something complex. Many people in the church today are undergoing this process. The rearrangement of the relationships and parts of things in our hearts, in the way we believe. We don't tend to call it decomposition, but we might call it deconstruction. A lot of people use that term. Say, oh, I'm going through a process where I'm reconsidering a lot of the things about God that I was taught, the things that I held as true before. We understand that. We've been through that process together here and are still going through it. It can feel and look and smell like a bad thing when you're in the middle of it. It can be scary. It can be, I don't want to take a bite of that. I don't want to eat any more of that because it's scary. But most of us can attest that this process produces something over time that's much more beautiful than it seemed to be when we started. Something that feels and looks and smells better than the way we were before. But it starts with a process of decay. It's the process of decay that creates leaven. And when applied to our worldviews and beliefs, the ones that maybe we had held for years, we can perceive it negatively. We can be anxious about it. Yet those of us who have followed Jesus and allowed him to initiate this process know that it will ultimately work things together for good in us. The concept of something that is hidden and then becomes visible, we find throughout the New Testament. Let me just point out a few of these things. And the reason I'm doing this is the parable, let me put it back up again. The kingdom of heaven is like leaven, he said, which a woman took and hid inside 3 measures of flour. Some of the translations use the word hid there. Others say she mixed it together with the flour. Hid is a much better translation of the Greek word. So the parable doesn't say that the woman mixed the leaven in to the flour. It says she hid it in the flour. Just keep that in mind as we look at a few other scriptures with that concept. This is Jesus speaking. This was to fulfill what had been spoken through the prophet. I will open my mouth and speak in parables. I will proclaim what has been hidden from the foundation of the world. He goes on, I thank you, Father, Lord of heaven and earth, because you have hidden these things from the wise and the intelligent and have revealed them to infants. Yes, Father, for such was your gracious will. Then when Jesus was foretelling his own death, he said, but they understood nothing about all these things. In fact, what he said was hidden from them, and they did not grasp what he said. So the video actually made reference to that. When Jesus told his disciples about how he was going to die and rise again, they just didn't get it. It was hidden from them. But the parable of the woman who hid the leaven tells us that these bits of leaven from Jesus were not wasted. They were hidden. Hidden inside of those who accepted him, but also hidden inside those that didn't. Because they heard the words, right? They heard what he was saying. For many of them, over time, those bits of leaven began to work. And the leaven began to affect the structure of those people's beliefs, the arrangement of and the relationships between the parts or elements of their complex personalities. And that lives that were formerly brittle and flat began to be transformed. Now I want to focus for a minute on how much flour Jesus makes reference to in this parable. He says the woman took and hid the leaven inside 3 measures of flour. I always assumed that 3 measures of flour was probably like 3 cups of flour or something like that. You know, some kind of a kitchen measuring device. Something that might make a loaf or two of bread. But when I got looking into that phrase, 3 measures of flour, I found out that that's not correct. A measure of flour in the Bible is equivalent to about 3 gallons of flour. About 16 pounds is 1 measure of flour. He says this woman mixed leaven into 3 measures of flour, or 9 gallons, or roughly 50 pounds of flour. Now, when we buy flour in the grocery store, we usually buy a 2-pound bag? It's about this big. A 5-pound bag? 10 times that amount. And that 10-pound bag can make quite a bit of bread, right? That 5-pound bag that we get at the grocery store, 10 times that is what Jesus is talking about here. So for Jews listening to Jesus tell this parable, I think they would have immediately remembered another story from their scriptures about another woman making 3 measures of flour into cakes. And it's a story we've talked about. In Genesis 18, we read that the Lord appeared to Abraham as 3 strangers, or 3 visitors. Abraham was a man of hospitality, and he welcomed them, he washed their feet, and he said, "Will you stay and let me feed you a meal?" They said yes. And then he goes to his wife Sarah, and he says, Abraham hastened into the tent to Sarah and said, "Make ready quickly 3 measures of choice flour, knead it, and make cakes." 50 pounds of flour for 3 visitors. Interesting. Seems that Abraham was extremely generous. He also killed the fatted calf, too, and laid that before his guests. For 3 guests, 3 visitors or 3 strangers. And then he set this extravagant meal in front of these visitors. And after he did that, they said this, "Where is your wife Sarah?" And he said, "There in the tent." Then one said, "I will surely return to you in due season, and your wife Sarah shall have a son." So Sarah, at Abraham's instructions, would have hidden leaven in bread, in 50 pounds of flour, that she made for the visitors, just like the woman in Jesus' parable did. And like the woman in the parable, she hid it in this extravagant amount of flour, about 9 gallons. That would have made a huge amount of cakes for these 3 visitors. And then in seeing that, one of the visitors tells the barren old lady, Sarah and Abraham, that they will have a son. The Lord had actually appeared to Abraham several years earlier and gave him a preview of this. He said, "I will make you exceedingly fruitful, and I will make nations of you, and kings shall come from you." So the people listening to Jesus tell this parable that day knew this story about Sarah and the 3 measures of flour. They knew this story about Sarah hiding leaven in 3 measures of flour for 3 strangers, and about how she became pregnant, and within her was hidden a child of promise. That Isaac was hidden within her. And from Isaac came Jacob, and then the nation of Israel, through which all the nations of the earth would be blessed. And now Jesus is telling us another story about another woman, again hiding leaven in 3 measures of flour. And if his listeners had ears to hear, they would be thinking of Sarah and the 3 measures of flour and the 3 strangers that carried the promise of God's covenant to Abraham and Sarah. But this time, instead of the Lord appearing as 3 strangers, the Lord appeared as the man, Jesus of Nazareth. And he's telling this parable within a series of other parables about soil and seed and fruitfulness and hidden coins and mustard seed and weeds that should not be pulled out, of treasures hidden in a field and pearls of great price, stories of things hidden, of treasures lost and treasures found, of small things becoming mature, of insignificant things becoming significant. And with this story about a woman hiding leaven in 3 measures of flour, he's reminding them of a covenant that the Lord had made with Abraham but he's also preparing the soil in them for a new covenant, a better covenant, a covenant that would also be enacted by three, a covenant in which the Father sent his Son and the Son sent his Spirit. But these three would no longer be strangers. They'd be friends. These three would no longer be visitors, but full-time residents. Stories about a kingdom that is like a woman hiding leaven in an extravagant amount of flour. So why did Abraham ask Sarah to hide leaven in 50 pounds of flour just for three visitors? And why did Jesus tell this parable saying that his kingdom is like a woman who hid leaven in 50 pounds of flour? Well, here's one way I'm going to propose today that we might understand the parable of the woman who hid the leaven. Now, this is not to say this is the only way you can understand that. We know that parables, by their nature, can be understood in multiple ways. But here's the one that I'll propose today. The Father is the woman. The flour is the entire world. Jesus is the leaven, and the Spirit empowers and raises Jesus. See, the Father is the woman who sends and hides the leaven, Jesus, into the world, the flour. He's hidden in the form of a human being, so we don't recognize him as God. In fact, like leaven, he had no form or majesty that we should look at him, nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by others, a man of suffering and acquainted with infirmity. As the one from whom others hide their faces, he was despised, and we held him of no account. Also, like leaven, Jesus is the sourdough starter that changed the structure of everything. He began changing the arrangement of relations between the parts or elements of something complex. People, yes, but all of creation, actually, Paul says. But we didn't like our parts and our elements being changed and rearranged. So just as the leaven began to work, Jesus began to do his work, we killed the leaven. But it was too late. The leaven had already begun its work in the world. And the Spirit who had empowered the leaven raised Jesus from the dead. And when the raised Jesus said, "Peace be with you, do not be afraid," a very pleasing aroma began filling the earth, because we didn't think God could be like that he would respond to our violence against him with forgiveness toward us. But this is why Jesus could say, "I am the bread of life." The leaven is what makes that irresistible aroma of freshly baked bread possible. Today, the Spirit is at work until the whole world is leavened. And the fruit of the Spirit is what makes those who partake of the bread of life attractive to the world. This is how the whole world is leavened with the leaven of heaven. This is the parable of the woman who hid the leaven. So for our discussion today, here's just a few thoughts. Are our lives attracting others to the bread of life? What I'm proposing is the fruit of the Spirit in our lives should create an aroma, if you will, in our lives like that of freshly baked bread that makes us attractive to people in the world. Certainly won't be to everybody, because not everybody was attracted to Jesus. We understand that people, some rejected him, some accepted him. But should we not ought to be aspiring to have the same kind of fragrance about our lives as Jesus did, knowing that, yes, it will be accepted by some and rejected by others. How can we cooperate with the Spirit's work of leavening the world today? We can we can just tell people about Jesus. We can demand that they believe in Jesus. We can, out of our desire to save them, we can be insistent and tell them all kinds of things about Jesus. But if we don't have the fragrance of the bread of life, we won't be attractive like that bread was in my grandmother's kitchen. They got me up in the morning. It's very difficult to describe a fragrance to somebody. You ever tried doing that? You can't describe a fragrance apart from saying it's like some other fragrance, because our sense of smell is such a unique sense. So we have to use metaphor all the time. But the idea is, if we're not giving off a fragrance that's pleasing to other people, we're just not going to be attractive to them. Our lives should be producing the fragrance of Jesus. So today I propose one way we might understand this short parable. Does that make sense? Or I'd love to hear if you have another way we might think of it too.